This is a CBC podcast.
Tansé, Anine, Bonjour, hello, and welcome. This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1. I'm Rosanna Deerchild. It's the International Year of Indigenous Languages. The United Nations proclaimed 2019 as the year to raise awareness about endangered Indigenous languages across the world. 40% of the estimated 6,700 languages around the world are in danger of disappearing. Here in Canada, though, there are efforts to reverse that. Today on Unreserved, reclaiming and revitalizing Indigenous languages.
When I want to say something very important, I relate it in Mi'kmaq. It's important to me, and it's important for my people, so I try to relate that positive part.
Yeah.
And that's been my language since the day I was born. We don't have the R sound, for instance, or a certain like B, the B, we use the P, and for us it's a soft B or the P. B. We don't use the C or D, the T we use, and E has the sound, and the vowels are E sound is the I, O, U. And those are the vowel sounds.
That's Mi'kmaq poet Rita Joe talking to Peter Zosky on Morningside in May of 1996, teaching him some of the sounds of the Mi'kmaq language. Rita Joe is often referred to as the poet laureate of the Mi'kmaq people. Even though she passed away in 2007 at the age of 74, Rita Joe's words live on. Her iconic poem, I Lost My Talk, about the loss of language in residential school, has been immortalized in music and theater, and now in a children's book. Rebecca Thomas, a former poet laureate of Halifax, was asked to write a companion book to Rita Joe's famous poem. It's called I'm Finding My Talk. Rebecca, welcome back to the show.
Gwe, thank you for having me.
So why did you accept this invitation to create the companion book?
I mean, who wouldn't? I guess if you were a Mi'kmaq person and a writer and you understood the significance of Rita Joe, like that is such a tremendous honor. I felt I had no choice, nor did I want to be given one. I was going to do it no matter what.
Yeah, they were like, you do this, and you're like, okay.
100%.
100%.
Didn't mean that I wasn't really nervous and scared that I wasn't going to do a good job, but I was determined to do justice to her work.
And you certainly did. Rita Joe went to Shubenacadie School, and that was the same school your father attended.
Yes, that's correct.
Were you thinking of him while you were writing the book?
Absolutely. The first stanza is talking about my dad's experience and how it relates to me, and I dedicated the book to him.
Oh, how did he feel about you taking on the project?
I mean, my dad has always been one of my biggest fans. He's so very proud. My dad has a lot of kids, but I'm the only kid that lives in Mi'kmaq territory and is very active in the community and kind of cultural pieces. So he's so thrilled. He shows YouTube videos to everybody all the time, much to my embarrassment, and brags to everyone that I was the former poet laureate and all that sort of stuff. So he's just thrilled. He's just thrilled that I'm doing this work.
And does he still speak the language?
He doesn't. He has good pronunciation when I play him stuff from the language app. So Mi'kmaq Ginad Manoe, they started a language app, and so I can play sounds for him and words for him, and he gets it pretty quickly. And sometimes when I call him up, I'll say "Gwe, Madawlin," like "How are you? Hello," and he'll answer back in English. So there's some stuff that's in his brain that's still in there, but he doesn't speak it with any capacity or fluidness.
What is your relationship to the language? Are you reclaiming it after not hearing it growing up?
I'm doing the best I can. Mm-hmm. It's nothing like English. It's nothing like French, which are the two languages I learned growing up. but I have really wonderful friends and community members who grew up speaking it as a first language. So I'll ask them questions or they'll help me with my pronunciation. And I'm learning that there's like an old Mi'kmaq and there's like a new Mi'kmaq. And some of the words that I learned, depending on who's teaching me, are from both worlds and both time frames, which is interesting because I asked one of my friends, oh, like, how does this mean? Or like, do I say it like this? And he goes, that's like old Mi'kmaq. Like, that's the Mi'kmaq that I hear, my mom and my grandma speak. Like, how did you learn that? And so that's been really cool, trying to learn those differences.
Well, Rebecca, let's hear the book. Read it out for us, and I'd love to hear it.
I'll read the dedication, and then I will read a few stanzas. I want to dedicate this book to my dad, who passed on as much as he could. He taught me what he had left and encouraged me to learn what he couldn't teach. Kesalo. I'm finding my talk, the one I never had, the one that the schools took away from my dad. I'm finding my talk one word at a time. Gwe, Walalan, Namotas. Sometimes they are very old and sometimes they rhyme. I'm finding my talk when I'm up on the stage, telling big stories or scribbling words on a page. I'm finding my talk. I'm meeting my family. I'm making new friends who choose to love me. I'm finding my talk with clumsy feet that pat down the grass with every drum beat. I'm finding my talk with every bead. My regalia speaks through each stitch and seam. I'm finding my talk in my smudge bowl, when the smoke curls around me and makes me whole.
Oh, man, I got the feels. I'm just crying. That's beautiful.
Thank you
for reading that.
No problem. I hope the little ones who read it connect to it as well.
I'm sure they will. Do you know how many speakers there are left of the Mi'kmaq language?
A lot. I don't have a number for you, but I know that the Mi'kmaq language is one of the few Indigenous languages in Canada that's doing a really good job of maintaining and growing speakers. So in Eskasoni First Nation, they have a Mi'kmaq immersion school, elementary school. So every kid who goes to elementary school on that reserve, and it is our biggest reserve, goes through Mi'kmaq immersion for many, many years. So we are growing it, and a lot of communities, especially in Unama'ki, like in Cape Breton, speak it in the home. It's still a first language in a lot of ways. So, and that's just in Cape Breton, and we've got lots of speakers in northern New Brunswick. It's a different dialect, but it's moving on, and it's becoming quite common.
Rita's poem is about how her language is taken from her in residential schools, and yours is about reclaiming it. Why is that important?
I think it's important to try. I don't think I'll ever get an opportunity to really become 100% fluent in Mi'kmaq just because I don't live in a community. I don't have any speakers around me all the time. But I think it's really important to try to connect back. I think, that is something that not everyone agrees with. I know that there are some folks who, in our communities, and it happens, and from my understanding, a lot of communities that will language shame people. If you can't do it perfect, don't do it at all. But I don't believe that, because I think that having some grasp of the language is really important to understanding your culture than having no grasp at all. And I hope that this book helps with that, because I talk about learning my language literally one word at a time. And that's something that for me is kind of like a little piece of resistance every time I learn a new word.
There's a lot of talk around this idea that culture and language are intertwined and they're connected, and one lives within the other. Have you heard this, and how do you explain to people that this is why it's important?
Yeah, I've heard this a lot, and I actually had a little bit of that into a talk that I did yesterday. And in Mi'kmaq, we have this word called Nidugulunk, and it's kind of like the Mi'kmaq worldview of like existing and conservation and everything. And the way Albert Marshall, who is a really respected elder in language carry in Eskasoni, explains it, it's basically, I cannot take too much of anything. And that becomes like, that understanding of the language becomes a really integral part of your culture and how you see the world and where you fit into it, and what kind of expertise and allowances that you have. Something is just as simple as one word helps paint a picture of how you're supposed to interact with the world around you. I cannot take too much of anything. Now, in this climate crisis, could you imagine if we actually ran our resource management with that in mind? I cannot take too much of anything. I think we would be in a very different world.
Absolutely. What is your hope for finding my talk and for the children who read it?
I hope that it gives hope and to show resilience and strength, and that we may be different, but it doesn't make us any less legitimate or authentic. It doesn't make who we are any less Mi'kmaq. So if someone who grows up speaking the language as a first language will be the same kind of hope and carrier of community and culture as somebody who is relearning what was taken away from them or the generations before them. That we're all in this together, so we kind of have to move forward supporting one another.
Thank you so much for your time today, Rebecca.
Thank you so much for having me.
Poet on.
Yes.
Rebecca Thomas is a poet and spoken word performer. Her book, I'm Finding My Talk, is out now, as well as a new illustrated children's edition of Rita Joe's famous poem, I Lost My Talk. This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1, Sirius XM 169, and Native Voice 1. I'm Rosanna Deerchild. 2019 is the International Year of Indigenous Languages, and people across the country are learning language in all different ways.
I thought this would be a great avenue to start teaching some basics of Inuvialuktun. So you've been learning some stories, hearing some stories this week and last week about grandparents and grandparenting and grandchildren this last week. Here are some kinship terminology. Grandmother, we learned how to say grandmother.
Still to come, how an Unreserved radio show is helping language learners in the North. This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1, Sirius XM 169, and Native Voice 1. I'm Rosanna Deerchild. The loss of Indigenous languages is widespread across Turtle Island. And with more Indigenous people moving off reserve and into urban areas, Indigenous language retention can be even more challenging. Statistics show more than half of Indigenous people in Canada live in metropolitan areas. But some are working to make language learning resources available to all Indigenous people who want them, no matter where they are. Lorna Williams is Leithawat from the St'át'imc First Nation in BC. She is a professor emerita at the University of Victoria and helped develop 2 programs in Indigenous language revitalization. She says for Indigenous people, language is more than just a communication tool.
There have been many policies and practices that have caused an out-migration from our communities, for reasons for education, economic, health, social services. When you think about the number of children, for example, who have been removed by social services, separated from their parents and their families, and placed in foster families, all of those often are in urban areas. People have left because of poor housing in communities or lack of employment, and so there's just been so much movement amongst our people. And the other reason why it's really important to work with people who no longer live in their language homelands, who often live in urban areas, is because there has been no services in Canada that has provided language and culture services to people who live away from their homes.
Daniel Kaufman, a linguist and assistant professor at Queen's College at City University of New York, has been working to preserve endangered languages in that city. He says one of the biggest challenges is the lack of recognition of Indigenous people in that area.
Yeah, well, within the New York area, there's several such tribes that are unrecognized. The Ramapo and others in New Jersey and in Long Island as well. And these are communities that have not had a fluent speaker for maybe up to 100 years. And so the non-recognition of their languages and the non-recognition of their entire existence as Native people is a constant wound, I think. And some recognition, right? But most New Yorkers don't even know on whose land they are. There's only a vague recognition that the Lenape are the traditional owners of the land that New York City stands on. So the language, the people, even the name, all of these things are completely invisible. And so it is part of this larger struggle. To recognize the language is also to recognize the people.
If an Indigenous group is not recognized by the federal government, they don't receive federal funding. And without federal funding, it's much more challenging to create meaningful language programming, Kaufman says. He's co-director of the Endangered Language Alliance, a nonprofit that helps Indigenous groups navigate these issues. But not all of those Indigenous groups are from New York.
So in New York, we have the added wrinkle, which is that many of our the Indigenous people that we work with are from Latin America and very often undocumented, and so as a result, completely invisible to city agencies and the state. So they're lumped in together with Spanish speakers in most cases, but in many cases they can't speak Spanish, or Spanish is far from a comfortable language for them. So there's real communication problems, and it's kind of a hidden population that's really neglected by all the services in the city, as I said. So there's a very critical issue of basic communication. Beyond that, there's also the issue of human rights. So, language is more than just a means of communication. It's an identity. And when certain identities have been systematically erased by the state over centuries, then we believe that the state has an obligation to help restore those languages. So there's kind of two things there, right? The language as a vehicle of communication, sometimes in life and death situations, and language as identity.
For Williams, the work to make these languages more accessible is important, and it's personal.
Until I went to school, I spoke only my language, Lilwat. And I spoke some words because my brothers were preparing me to go to school, so they were teaching me some English words. And then I went to a residential school in grade 2. And, in 3 years, I had lost the ability to communicate in any language. And it was only spending time back in my community that I relearned my language and then learned English because I ended up in the hospital after my stint in residential school. And so because I was able to now speak, at that time when I was about 10 years old, both my language and English, I became an interpreter in my community, even though I didn't know that's what I was doing. And so language has always been an interest, I think, because it's been a part of my life.
As the International Year of Indigenous Languages wraps up, lots more light was shed on efforts from people like Williams and Kaufman. But with that, both of them predict there will be additional challenges and narratives that they'll have to work against.
There's a misconception, I think, that we're going to have to fight against over the next few years, that there's global languages and then there's Indigenous languages, and that global languages can be spoken wherever you go, and that they're not tied to a place, but that Indigenous languages are tied to a place. And that's true. Indigenous languages are tied to a place, but so are global languages. But Indigenous languages have just as much a right to be spoken in any city or on any planet as English or French or Spanish. So that's, I think, something that we'll have to focus on as we really get to work on this language access issue.
We live in a very new era where people can be connected across space and time because of technology. And but technology has become the new colonizer, and we need to be able to change that and to make use of them and to make use of the technological tools that we have available to connect people rather than to disconnect people. And so I'm hoping that we're entering a good time and that people can join us and partner with us to work towards ensuring that people can practice and realize their right to their language.
That's Lorna Williams and Daniel Kaufman on working with Indigenous language access in urban centers. Last January, to mark the International Year of Indigenous Languages, we launched a new podcast feature. It's called First Words, and it's a series that introduces you to people who are fluent in their Indigenous language or are still on their journey to learn.
Jordan kunniu yunga people le yuliriu kataw yunga ikalungni CBC kunnu tamani hiulek tunga tak ukiuni 6 ni ajilok te kataw lunga lu tamani people le yuliriu kataw yun. My name's Jordan Kunnik. I'm originally from Akvet, Nunavut, but I moved here 6 years ago. Started working at CBC as a reporter. When I started as a reporter, I did a lot of reporting and also versioning, meaning that I'm doing translation on different stories by someone else. And then when I do my own stories, I did them in English, in Inuktitut, because we have a lot of Inuktitut speaking people across the territory, and that's mainly why we're here. So Igalak goes on in Iqaluit time. It's 6 o'clock. It starts, and it goes on from Monday to Friday. So there's a lot of people in the territory that tune into Igalak. It's a very popular show in Nunavut, mainly because it's Inuktitut, and we tell stories from the territory, and we also speak to different people across Canada and the issues that matter to Nunavummiut. So when you go out to communities, you meet people and they recognize you and they want to talk to you, meet you, and all that stuff, just like when you see famous people out there. But this one is like getting to meet them and knowing that people are out there listening to what you're telling. So when you go to homes and it's 6 o'clock or 5 o'clock, wherever you are, you see the families tune up the volume when the show is on and everybody's quiet. And even little kids like 2-year-olds and all that stuff that watch the show, whether it's for the news or the birthday greetings or the weather even, they like to see their community. So in, I think it was October, I went to Alviet, to where I come from, and spoke to the community about the polar bear issues that they've had. And I've known this for years because I come from there and I've seen that myself. But the polar bears had become a more serious issue when 2 people died in 2 months. So I wanted to talk to people and figure out what they think should be done. And so I came there and did a story on them and the issues that they see. And so the National was interested in the story, and one of the producers had asked me, can you get the recording done in 5 minutes? And I was like, that's not going to happen. It's not my language. If you want me to get it done in 5 minutes, I would have to speak it in my language. So I ended up recording the story in English and then sent it to them. And then maybe a day or and a half later, they called me and said, can you do it in Inuktitut? And I said, I would be more than happy to do that. Akbet nunabut minigani helnik panguyok. Terok pala magin naktok nunalik 2,500 ni inokakuni. Amihut inuit tamani makay hoktut ekale hoktulu. Unwa kutaw toko rayakovit ay bale itit pileribik ni. 250 kilograms okumay nilik nanok. Nekik kaminit kinekto. Jordan Kuni, CBC Pivalet, Kalungni. Talking to people, it was a history in the making to speak a different language on the national, and I was very honored to do that. people all over Canada were messaging me and talking to me, saying they were amazed by the story and how we put it together, and a lot more people in my community being able to speak Inuktitut. So a lot of people were happy. My fiance, she speaks English. She understands in Inuktitut, but so I remind her, these are my kids. I want them to speak Inuktitut because it's part of our identity, and I want them to be able to communicate to elders. Growing up with my grandparents, I remember that one time when I came home for vacation from work, and I let my grandpa listen to radio, and you could really tell how happy he was to listen to something. And so he put his head near the stereo and was trying to listen. And as soon as the English part came, he put his head up and stopped listening. That's when I realized how important the language is. And I mean, I've spoken it all my life, but here in the Kalui, I seem to be speaking a lot more English, and so I wanted to make sure that my babies are going to be able to speak Inuktitut. One of the tweets, the image of my grandma from 1949 when she was 17, it's actually gone viral, and a lot of people were commenting the face shows confidence and she has a lot of power in her face. So I think I can say Biyung Nangnek means power. The image that people saw, people kept commenting, she looks like she has a lot of power and confidence. My name's Jordan Kundik, and today's Inuktitut word of the day is Biyung Namet, which means power.
That was CBC Iqaluit reporter Jordan Kundik. His story was recorded as part of our First Words podcast, which shares stories of people and their connection to their Indigenous language. If you sign up for the Unreserved podcast, you'll also get episodes of First Words delivered straight to your phone. Dodi Malagana grew up with her grandparents in Aklavik, Northwest Territories, where they communicated with her in Inuvialuktun. Now she passes on that knowledge. She hosts an Inuvialuktun language show, Tusavik. It broadcasts to her hometown and nearby every weekday.
Uvlumini tumilika vanga shukralak Dodi Malagana. Uvlabaktak kekun angunegavik, uvloa aipiginik.
On the show, she helps teach the language to people who didn't grow up hearing it at home. But the story of how she ended up speaking her language professionally on air has a twist.
I grew up with the Inuvialuktun language being spoken ever since I was a baby, I guess, because I was custom adopted to my grandparents, Johnny and Dora Malagana. And I always credit them for me being able to understand and to speak Inuvialuktun. I know a lot of people, when they went to residential schools, they were forced to speak and learn English. And due to colonization in residential schools, they were not allowed to speak their languages. As far as I know, my grandfather did not go to residential school. I could be wrong, but he's never mentioned residential school. And my grandmother, Mom, mentioned that she went to residential school for 1 week, but she said she didn't like it, so she told her dad, and so her dad took her out of there, so she only stayed there for a week. So I'm always thankful that she didn't go. So it's because of my grandparents who hardly could speak English. They were pretty much unilingual, and they could only speak, broken English type thing. So it was always spoken to us in the home. we responded to my grandparents in English. I just grew up hearing it, but I didn't speak it at the time. So basically, I was able to understand Inuvialuktun growing up. So taking that into my adult years, and when my grandparents passed away and I moved away from my community, I continued watching and listening to other Inuvialuktun programs like Tumapta or Swangan, so I could continue hearing the language and not forget it. And so I kept myself immersed in the language that way, I guess. And so when I started working for CBC the very first time, it was in the early 2000s. I was teaching at the St. Joe's Catholic School, I believe, in Yellowknife. I was just counting down the days to the end of the school year, and I was teaching Aboriginal studies, what we called it Northern Studies, to be inclusive to all students. I was approached by my principal, who was approached by a CBC staffer because they were having a difficult time finding a replacement for the present host at the time. And they couldn't find someone to fill in the holiday for the host. Before I was asked to backfill for CBC in early 2000s, the only thing that I can recall in speaking Inuvialuktun was speaking to my kids now and then. When my children were smaller, I'd tell them, okay, I'm going to have 10 minutes where I'm only going to speak Inuvialuktun. So I thought about it, and I thought to myself, well, I never really made an effort to speak it, and they were going to put on a different Indigenous program so the elders wouldn't be hearing Inuvialuktun for 3 weeks. And so I thought, I'll try it for the elders to see if I could provide the programming for them in Inuvialuktun. I thought, there's nothing to lose. It's only temporary, and I'm either going to sink or swim and make a complete fool of myself, or else I'll do relatively okay.
Good afternoon, Inuit Nanilaka, Vanga Dodi Allen, Kinawana Holiday Man, Havaktunga Ovani, CBC me, Havangaktunga Ovani, July 19.
I remember I was really, really nervous. I was thinking to myself, what have I gotten myself into? My knees were very weak. When people saw me afterwards, they were saying, wow, I was so surprised to hear you speaking in Inuvialuktun. And people were really happy that a younger person was speaking the language, so it kind of caught many people off guard. I remember one lady was telling me that her dad or her uncle, was so touched by a younger person speaking that, it brought him to happy tears. So people were pleasantly surprised that a younger person at the time was, speaking Inuvialuktun. That was kind of the beginning. It was kind of a relief as, things got a little bit easier each time, but still challenging, of course. But facing your fears and trying something different was exciting. When I first started permanently hosting Tusavik in 2015, I thought this would be a great avenue to start teaching some basics of Inuvialuktun. So you've been learning some stories, hearing some stories this week and last week about grandparents and grandparenting and grandchildren this last week. Here are some kinship terminology. Grandmother, we learned how to say grandmother. I noticed there's two ways of saying it. Anna and Anana. I noticed Anna. So I would begin with, 3 words or phrases a day. The longer I did it, more people were telling me that they really appreciate the language lessons on Tusavik Radio, and that they're learning from it. We're in the era now where there seems to be more people interested in revitalizing and strengthening our language. not only in our communities, but in Canada. There seems to be a kind of resurgence of preserving and maintaining our Indigenous languages and our stories, and I'm really thankful that I can be a part of that to help to preserve and not to lose our Inuvialuktun languages.
Dodie Malagana lives in Edmonton now. She still connects with her community in the Northwest Territories by hosting Tusavik. Thanks to Katie Toth from CBC Yellowknife for that story. There are lots of different ways to pick up new words when you're learning a new language, and many of them involve technology. On the East Coast, there's an online Mi'kmaq language resource called The Language Keeper. The CBC's Caitlin Swan brings us that story.
Onui mi, Onuizi.
Language Keeper is an online resource that teaches Mi'kmaq through daily video flashcards. A video is posted every day on Facebook and other social media platforms. Each one has a written Mi'kmaq word or phrase.
Edldlia mawiomi, Onuizi.
The movement was started by Savannah Simon, who taught different dialects of Mi'kmaq through social media. But new content slowed after a move across the country and a new baby, and it's now being revitalized by her brother and her mother, Talon and Heidi Simon. The UN has declared this year the Year of Indigenous Languages, and Talon Simon says this is the perfect timing to rejuvenate the language movement.
To know our language is to see what our ancestors saw, because our language is so old and it holds so many gems and so many beautiful stories. I'm able to talk to my mom, my elders in their language, and they smile because they know that it'll be all right, for us, that the youth are carrying it on.
Talon says his work is the most rewarding when he hears his 3-year-old nephew, Savannah's son, speaking in Mi'kmaq.
Rescue.
Wiskew.
Onuizi.
Both Talon and his mother hope to eventually have their teachings inside classrooms.
Thanks to the CBC's Caitlin Swan for sharing that story from Dartmouth. That's it for this week's episode of Unreserved. We'll be back in this radio space next week for more community, culture, and conversation. This episode was produced by Stephanie Cram, Zoe Tennant, Kyle Musica, and Anna Lazowski. Special thanks to Mary Catherine McIntosh this week. If you want to get in touch with us, you can email us at unreserved@cbc.ca or find us on Facebook and Twitter. I'm your favorite cousin, Rosanna Deerchild, coming at you from Winnipeg in Treaty 1 territory. Thank you for listening to Unreserved on CBC Radio 1. Ego say.
For more CBC podcasts, go to cbc.ca/podcasts.